This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
We're recording this on the 22nd of January. It's been just over 24 hours since Donald Trump was sworn in as US president for a second term. And what a whirlwind 24 hours it has been. In this episode, we talk about what his power moves say about the kind of president he wants to be and the kind of America we can expect, not just in the next few weeks or months, but years to come. How should countries like Singapore, where we are, or others in Asia see all this? And how should we respond? Joining us remotely is ST's Bureau Chief Bhagia. Hi, Bhagia.
Hey, hi, Suling. How are you?
Good. I wanted to actually start by maybe talking about the thing that has just happened, which is that Trump announcement about 10% tariffs on China. And you know, the thing about Trump is it's so hard to keep up because if we were recording this yesterday, the first question might have been about something else.
Absolutely. So the 10% actually, we wouldn't have heard about it, except for the fact that a reporter in that gathering, which is just after the announcement actually that he made on that $500 billion AI infrastructure related project that's being planned in the US. Now, after that was over, he had a little Q&A with reporters, and one of the reporter asked him about movement on tariffs and on China. And that's when he said that he was thinking about 10% on China. And this was because he said that fentanyl is still coming through the borders with Mexico and with Canada, that is. And of course, the argument is that the precursors for fentanyl comes from China. That's where the production is, and it finds its way there, and then it's smuggled across the border. And then that is a source of great concern. At least he likes to raise it all the time. And one reason, of course, is that it's a tragic thing that a large number of Americans, especially young Americans, and they tend to be white males, young males mostly, who die. And these people and their families are a large part of Trump's core constituency. So it is a big issue. I mean, it is a big issue. It was a big issue even with the Biden administration. So, and Trump has been talking about it even in his first term. I don't know if you remember that, but it's an issue, and he's raised it, he says, in the talks that he had with President Xi Jinping as well. Again, like I said, it's not an announcement as such. It's not like a considered announcement that here we are, and this is us through the US government that we are announcing this tariff on China.
But Bhagia, could you help us make sense of it all from Singapore? Because on the one hand, I think it's a challenge for the news because we're trying to discern to what extent is this a significant development. It's something that he said, so how much of it, this rhetoric will translate into reality, and how much of this is simply signaling in the power move such that he's in a better position if he does negotiate with China in the future when it comes to fentanyl and whatnot. How should we be seeing this in Singapore?
So I can think of two ways that we as, receivers of all the talk and the noise and everything around, and may I say confusion that's always swirling around Trump. And it's been the case with his first administration as well. I think first is, you can look at it as a power move because he does drop these, broad hints, or he talks very specifically about things and people draw their own conclusions based on what he said, because he is watched. Not only is he watched for what he says to reporters, but what he also says over Truth Social. For instance, the change of policy over TikTok in the latest instance that came over his Truth Social, and he wasn't even inaugurated at that point, right? So this is who he is. This is how he likes to communicate. So that's one part of it. The second thing is, if you want, as rational human beings and as, policymakers or people who are observing things who want to make sense of it, I think the official line on this is that the US administration is looking at these issues. And basically what the Trump administration has done is told various government agencies that look at where things stand, for instance, on trade deficits, which he is very big on that. And it's after all those things are considered that I think you might find something that would probably be policy. Now, can we conclude that because he said, I think, and he does say things like, I think we're looking at 10%, maybe by Feb 1. So there's always a lot of couching around in the way he says it so casually that you can keep it in mind. But who is to say tomorrow, if we were talking about it, it might be superseded by something bigger, or it might be that, it doesn't come up at all until much later.
You made a great point about 2 points really that I took away from what you just said. So the first really is he's signaling, right? And he's signaling that he's serious about it, but he kind of keeps us guessing as well because he says it in such casual, mild way. And the other point that you mentioned about how there's a whole bureaucracy behind him. So even if he says it in a mild and casual way, there is that juggernaut that will follow up with actions potentially. And so that threat, I guess, is very real. But we both know that, righting the trade imbalance is a key priority for Trump. So we know that there's going to be some seriousness over it. It's not just a casual announcement. It's not throwaway, and we've got to pay attention to that. I wonder though, because we haven't seen the across-the-board tariffs that he had promised on the campaign trail, and that's something he's said repeatedly. I wonder whether you think the delays of an announcement of a policy move there is a sign of an internal disagreement among, his staff or his leaders on how to proceed. And how soon do you think even Asian countries who might be caught in crosshairs will come into focus? I guess I'm asking also about the countries that have benefited from the China Plus One diversification strategies over the last couple of years. And that would include in this part of the world, Vietnam and India.
Yeah, that's right. So, trade has always been a big thing with him, deficit especially. He's talked about it. He's talked about tariffs as a means, like you say, signaling tariffs as bargaining chips. And that's something that other people who are going to be very important in his administration, and you can think of Treasury Secretary, for instance, Scott Bessent, or the incoming pick for commerce, which is Lutnick. So there is a spectrum of views that you find there. Some who do look at tariffs mainly as bargaining chips, and they look at a gradual kind of implementation depending on how the countries which are going to be subject to these things respond. And it's not clear whether they are all speaking in one line for things like across the board universal tariffs, or do they want them tied to specific sectors or to countries? And then you have people like Peter Navarro, you have the USTR, that is Jamie Grierson. And these people are more ideological, both about, in the first instance, about China specifically, but also, and this comes especially from Trump himself, this preoccupation with trade imbalances or deficits. So the two countries that you mentioned, I think you said China and Vietnam. So their policymakers, I think, will have to be watching this very carefully. And Trump, in a way, has also suggested a way out of this, which is that you can redress that balance. And one of the ways you can do it, and he's touting it for everyone to hear, which is buy American gas. He is wanting more production of oil and gas, which are already at record highs. But he still wants more. He wants to make it easier. He wants to take away any obstructions to the permitting process. He wants it all to start in Alaska and wherever. And if they produce this gas, then Asia is a consumer or a potential consumer. Then that's one way you bring down the imbalances. You bring down the surplus that you have in your trade with the US. And you buy other things as well. Last time it was, soybean and other things with China. So, yes, that is definitely a very big part of where this administration is headed as far as Asia and especially trade with Asia is concerned.
Just staying on this point about what you think Southeast Asian countries should do. So it reminds me of something that Ian Bremmer at the World Economic Forum in Davos said just yesterday on a panel on the 47th US presidency. And he said, countries should just give Trump what he wants. Focus on that. Don't bother aligning with US foreign policy or, siding the US on multilateral initiatives. What do you think then should Southeast Asian leaders bear in mind when they approach the US, when they meet Trump for the first time then?
Well, if you listen to him speak when he's speaking to anybody, actually, to leaders most certainly, and then to even the tech company CEOs that he was addressing the press conference with just, a few hours earlier when they were announcing the AI infrastructure project. Now, he is very generous. He praises them. He flatters them to skies. So maybe one is you might take that as a cue from his own. The way he likes to relate to people is by praising them. And so maybe that's the way you be polite to your guest. So maybe that's what Ian Bremmer was saying. I don't know some people say, Trump is very susceptible to flattery. So you want him to be nice to you, you be very, very super nice to him to begin with. So I don't know. This is part of diplomacy and statecraft. So I gather all that happens anyway. And now, what can they do? I think he pretty much tells you what he's looking for. And at this point, he's talking about curbing fentanyl. So if China were to make some undertaking that this would not happen, or we're going to punish people who are part of this track, or to announce some kind of crackdown on their end, then Trump is definitely going to regard that as a very friendly gesture to him and to the US. And he would reciprocate in some other manner. Then he's talked about TikTok, for instance, right? That if China approves it, then it's good for them, it's good for the US. So, he's practically telling you what to do. And one thing I just mentioned was American gas. So Southeast Asia, I mean, Vietnam has probably the third or the fourth largest trade surplus with the US, over $100 billion. So, that kind of thing would be very helpful, I think, if the leaders were to meet. Openness to investments would be a good idea. And openness to Trump's, what he's talked about, hasn't done it so far, but talked about investments coming into the US. He wants to build the domestic heartland, the manufacturing here. So if companies from there want to put in money here, as did that Dubai property developer and as did SoftBank. So those kinds of things would also be regarded as friendly and welcome. So I think that might be the way to deal with him, to bring that kind of, I don't know, is it businessman to businessman kind of mindset?
That is very interesting because your point about how it has to be mutually beneficial. I'm just curious because when it comes to foreign policy, though, one notable development was the Senate confirmation of Marco Rubio as Secretary of State. And that was a big statement. We know that he's hawkish. He was confirmed unanimously. I'm wondering whether to what extent you expect that his appointment will see a unified US foreign policy. I guess I am asking because if you recall the last time, Trump didn't have the best relationship with his first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and he didn't last very long, just over a year.
So I think, like you say, Mr. Rubio is a hawk. And actually, his foreign policy views are pretty much on the record. He's been on the Senate Intelligence Committee, on the Foreign Relations Committee. So maybe he brings more of a grasp on foreign affairs than maybe Rex Tillerson did. But yes, he has very strong views on China. He has also very strong views on Russia and Iran, North Korea. Now, there are some differences. Probably on China, they are pretty close. And so if you're talking of a unified foreign policy when it comes to China, I think maybe Mr. Rubio is more sort of ideological, where I think the word you want to say for Trump is transactional more than anything else. And on other things, they probably have some differences. On NATO, for instance, Trump, I think, has belittled NATO for a very long time, whereas Mr. Rubio, as senator, was part of a bill that said that if the US wants to pull out of NATO, wants to quit NATO, then it has to have 2/3 approval from the Senate. And then there are other differences on Russia. Mr. Rubio has been far more critical of Russia than I think Trump has ever been. Likewise, I can think of Taiwan. So Trump has kind of deterred a bit, right? He's criticized Taiwan for hurting the US chips industry, for instance. I think Rubio, however, is pretty consistent Taiwan supporter. But then I think you have to remember through all this that the foreign secretary basically serves at the pleasure of the president. And in this case, the president is Mr. Trump,
right,
who will prevail. And probably Mr. Rubio knew that when he signed up for the job. I think Trump is a very known personality. I think his management style is very well known. So, and I think American media has also been reporting ever since his name came up. Of course, back in the day, the two of them were contesting in the primaries, right? They were. So, but then since then, there has been a closing up of gap as far as foreign policy or his articulation of foreign policy has been. So that's the thing. Oh, and one other thing I think I should add is that foreign policy, of course, is not just the foreign secretary, right?
Yes.
The Secretary of State, right? Because it is the NSA as well who has a large role, right? That's been the case even in Biden administration. So you had in China, for instance, you had Jake Sullivan, the NSA, rather than Tony Blinken, who emerged as a sizable big voice on China and Chinese affairs. And then, I don't know, we still have to see what the equation is like, for instance, with Mike Waltz, who would be the NSA under Trump. But then again, he's also equally, if not more aggressive on China and for arming Taiwan and so on. And of course, he brings a military background as well, So there's always going to be differences of opinion. And I guess President Trump is maybe like a difficult character to deal with. Maybe if he's your boss, that's fairly well known, I think. So will there be a unified foreign policy? Well, Trump is always going to have the last word. So some of the differences may come through depending on how leaky this administration is, may come to the surface. Some we'll hear about, some we will not hear about. But there will be a US foreign policy which will largely emerge from the White House. I think we can be fairly certain when we say that.
So if we extrapolate, and I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm going to do that right now. If we crystal ball gaze a bit, it will all come to a litmus test with this one thing that Trump has also said. He said a lot of things, but he also said that he wants to visit China in 100 days. What do you think then would be the likely agenda? What sort of deal do you think he wants to make with President Xi Jinping? I mean, do you think this is going to be like a Nixon in China kind of moment?
Actually, well, wouldn't we all love to be the fly on the wall, so to speak, right? So yeah, we know that he wants to visit China, and he said in his 100 days, he kind of confirmed that yesterday. But what does he want of China? I mean, this he said even before he was inaugurated, that he wants China's help to end the Ukraine war. So I don't know what kind of gesture China wants to make towards that. But if China does, then, or if that is one of the things that he's seeking to do during that visit, it could be the thing. And then we've spoken about fentanyl precursors. We've spoken about the trade imbalance. What else might he seek if he went there? I think he would like...
What about TikTok?
Oh, yeah. So TikTok. Now, what he said is TikTok is nothing.
Yes.
If he doesn't allow it, if the ban takes into effect and, basically they do not have an American partner, they shut down operations. That's what it amounts to over the next less than 3 months. So he said, and we know that China would need to approve for that deal to happen, especially if the deal has to include that secret algorithm, right? Which is what makes TikTok so successful and so much more successful than I think the American peers here, right?
Yes.
So China has to agree to let that be exported. China has to sort of sign off on that deal. And wasn't there something yesterday from the Chinese Foreign Ministry sort of saying that, yes, that's something they could talk about? So I think China will also look for their, what can they get in exchange? So TikTok in exchange for some lower tariffs or something. I don't know. All this is behind the scenes, of course. So we can only speculate, yeah?
Yeah. The TikTok thing is just, so interesting because it exposes very interesting thinking. So on the one hand, I find it fascinating that the Americans want tech transfer, basically, of the algorithm from China to the Americans. This is a huge reversal from just, 10 years ago when the Americans say, no, there shan't be any tech transfer to China. And then the other thing is, I wonder whether this also reveals a chasm between policymakers. In the US, a lot of lawmakers had national security concerns with Americans using TikTok. Yet, on the other hand, this doesn't, or at least gives the impression that isn't such a big concern with Trump, and his concern is more about the deal making and whether it is going to be in America's business interests. Or is that an inaccurate, characterization?
No, I think it goes back to Trump being about making America great again. And I don't know to what extent he really cares about, or to what extent is that front of and center of his mind. He wants to get the best deal possible for America in any which way he can. So I think TikTok possibly is also one, maybe a bargaining chip that he has to get what he wants. How much does he have vested in TikTok itself? I mean, if you look at, he was trying to ban it himself, right? Just about in 2020, not too long ago. So why this flip-flop? I think people have lots of theories as to why that is. And Trump himself says it's because TikTok was helpful in getting him the youth vote. Maybe that's partly true, at least. And others say that it might be because, people who are close to him, his donors are actually big investors in ByteDance, the parent of TikTok. So because they have so much riding in this TikTok staying here and making lots of money, that they are able to prevail on some kind of deal needing to happen. But then I think your question is about whether there is a difference of opinion. To what extent is China really regarded as a national security threat? So when the congressmen were banning TikTok, they had a lot of evidence of spying happening and China having the ability to sway public opinion. And that was just before election. So it was particularly hot to talk about. A large part of it was sort of not revealed to the public. Those reasons were not revealed. What kind of evidence they had of China's ability or China actually doing things here to impact Americans. And the second part of it was communicating it, which was very weird because on one hand, they said this was a national security threat. But on the other hand, you had President Biden, you had everybody, lots of Republican lawmakers with large followings, having TikTok accounts with large followings in them. So that kind of uneven look was already there, right? So that's one. The second thing is, if you look at it a little more broadly, do American people not believe that China is a threat? I'm not sure if I agree entirely with that, because if you look at surveys from Pew, for instance, and they do have these regular surveys of what do Americans think of China, and it's almost always negative, and it's just grown darker and darker. I think last year, if I remember rightly, Pew said 80% of Americans have an unfavorable view of China, and I think 40% have particularly deeply unfavorable views. So I think they remain wary. But the question also is, maybe it depends on who is the messenger. Firstly, if you're sending mixed messages. And secondly, if you're Biden and you're unpopular, you have low job approval ratings, and this is your message. And as Republicans, maybe as young people especially, they're not particularly following him or on the same wavelength as him. But if, let's say, Trump tomorrow, hypothetically, okay, for whatever reason, right? If he says, look, TikTok, he changes his mind and we don't know why, but let's say it happens. That TikTok, he says, no, it's a menace. It's a planned or China spy or whatever. I think there would be a further opinion shift. I mean, right now we're talking of young Americans going over to, the other popular, the Red Note. Yeah. So, I mean, yes, but then I think I was also reading about how China itself isn't entirely sure whether they ought to welcome this, because then it breaches some guidelines they have towards what might be said or not. And Americans, some of them at least, are finding that it's tricky to be there and be able to say what you want to say. That's one. And the other part of it, it's also young people especially. And I heard a lot of interviews which said, we don't care. We just want to do that to spite you. This is like a teenager spiting his parent, that we're just trolling you, How does it last? All these are, it's fascinating. It's watching all these things happen in real time.
Yes.
And I guess we can all come up with different views on it. But I think at a very, I don't know, like they say at the 50,000 foot level, there is this wariness about China, which is shared in public opinion. There is also, if you look at how American policymakers approach China, they maybe sometimes don't criticize China, they criticize the Chinese Communist Party. So they try and draw a distinction that way as well. And there is the long-term and I think permanent change in the way they view each other, right? That I don't think has changed. And it does come down to, China, that is very much popular way of looking at it, that China takes away our jobs, China's hollowed us out, China takes advantage of us. So that's a very popular, people subscribe to that theory. Very much subscribe to that theory, whether it's coming from Trump, whether it comes from the local lawmaker or even from the Democrats. I think there is that, and it looks like it's there to persist.
So Bhagya, just stepping back and rounding off this podcast as well, the last 24 hours, there's been so many things said, so many executive orders signed, and you've said before also in your analysis that Donald Trump himself seems to be off to a blistering start. He seems to be in a hurry, but, at the end of the day, for what? And what do you think is the signal he's trying to send? And what should we take away from all this, looking at it from Asia's perspective?
Okay, so firstly, you can pretty much say that the reason I said he's off to a blistering start is because he laid out so many things in his inaugural speech. And he also followed up with that, a lot of executive orders. And he is sort of very keen that people, his voters, his supporters, see for themselves that the very big things that he's promised them, and in a very high profile way, he delivers on them. In the sense, he's almost giving a daily update of progress. Yeah. So you see that on his Truth Social. He posts the kind of things he's doing. I'm on the press list from the Trump Vance team. They also like to remind the press on these are the things we promised, promises made and promises kept. So that's one part of it. And that's what he's trying to do. And then, of course, it goes back to the kind of political leader he is. He's in the showman kind of mold, right? He does like spectacle. He likes grand talk. He believes in his own thing as a deal maker. And seeing all that, he's a one-term president, right? In the sense that he can't contest again. So he's definitely working towards his legacy as well. Maybe that's also kind of explains the hurry. American presidents in the end just get about a year and a half in which they can have their maximum impact, because beyond that, 2 years from now, it's midterm elections. And who knows if his party is going to remain in majority in Congress, for instance. So if you want to do things, you need to be in a hurry. I think in that sense, almost every president has to do that. It is the nature of the political system. With Trump, it's just larger than life. He makes it such, that's a style of communicating as well. If you want to look at it a little more philosophically, I guess you could say that this is political capital, right? It's a fleeting thing. You don't earn interest on it, right? You use it or you lose it. No point saving it. So if you've got something, if you keep saying that I've come with landslide support, which in a way he has not, because it's a narrow victory he had over Kamala Harris. And, it's not as big a deal as he makes of it. But since he does do that, he's got to deliver. And I think this is why he got off to this big start. And he'd been hyping it up, for ages. He said on day one, I'll do this. I'll be dictator on day one. So he hasn't been a dictator, except, of course, he gave the deportation, made actions towards the deportation of illegal immigrants, which is a big issue with his own issue and issue with his voters. And then the baby drill part of it. So he has kind of, to that extent, done what he said he would do. Yeah. And as we were discussing on tariffs, not as much. But the signal is basically to his audience is definitely his voters. And then everybody, he's got his agenda and he's signaling. The man works very hard. Okay, you've got to give that to him. Just yesterday, did he put in 14, 16 hours, I think? And he's 78, right? It must be exhausting. And I think after I went to bed, I saw in the morning
he was up
put
already.
Out some truth. Yeah, at 2 a.m. he had something out on firing some people. So I think maybe that was the one where he said, Jose Andre, the chef.
Yes.
He said, you're fired, and some other people. So he's super energized. Or I don't know, he just has insomnia or whatever it is. And this is what his supporters seem to want and expect from him, right?
Yeah.
So that's there. And maybe he wants to show the Democrats down. He loses no chance to do that. So all that is part of his signaling, messaging. It's part of Trump himself. I don't know if you can separate that from him. This is how he's been. This is how we've seen him. He does seem a little more serious. That's all I would say. I was watching him yesterday. He's still himself. He still wants to talk and command attention, which he will. Of course, he's the president and he wants to have the last word. All that is part of it. Well, I hope I answered your question. I think I got carried away.
That was a great summary. And I guess that nicely wraps up our podcast. Basically, it's Donald Trump, the man, hardworking, here to fulfill all his campaign promises, and he's in a big hurry to edge out his legacy. So thanks a lot, Bhagya. That really nicely wraps up our chat.
Of course, it means we'll be exhausted all through this. But this is the golden
Hopefully
age.
we have more stamina.
Yes.
It's a good time to cover the US.
I think so. Well, thank you so much. It was great talking to you.
And you've been listening to Asian Insider. I'm Lin Suling. Every third Friday of each month, join us as we catch up with our US Bureau Chief, Bhagya Sri Garika, for the latest analysis of the hottest talking points generated by the political scene in the US. And if you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with your friends and family. This episode was produced and edited by Faiza Sani. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.